Here's an individual who says, thanks for a great baking idea. If I'm not mistaken, I think this was the video where I ate a low-carb muffin. And instead of my blood sugar going up, it went down after an hour or so. And they make this statement about that. They say, if that little insulin from your pancreas made a big difference, in other words, it was obviously a little release of insulin that caused my blood sugar to go down. So they say, well, why not feed the body with insulin? I mean, injecting insulin. What is the problem if you use it judiciously? So essentially they're saying, well, is it always wrong to take insulin? Can it not be helpful? And I'm going to say something that a lot of keto folks would never say. I'm going to say, based on some of the reading I've done with Dr. Richard Bernstein, that, yeah, it could be helpful in times. Your body was made to use insulin. It was made for insulin. If your body makes no insulin and you don't inject yourself, you die. You've got to use insulin. Now, there is one way you wouldn't have to use insulin if you just don't eat. And you say, well, I'll never eat again. Then you don't need insulin. But you'll die that way as well. So there's nothing wrong with injecting insulin, especially if your body makes no insulin. But what about if your body makes a little bit of insulin, but not much? And there are some like that. And so the question this person is asking is, well, is it such a terrible thing to inject yourself with insulin if you need it? And my answer would be, no, it's not that terrible. In fact, when I was just getting started, I read a book about a lady who tells her experience with Dr. Bernstein. She was one of his patients. And she went to him and she was a raging diabetic. Her blood sugar was way out of control. And he suggested that she give herself small amounts of insulin for a while to give her pancreas a rest and get her blood sugars down. And she just wouldn't hear of it. To her, the idea of taking a needle and injecting yourself with insulin was just horrific. And she said, no, let me try it on my own. Now, her story ended up good because she cut her carbs so low that she actually got her blood sugar under control without the insulin. But Dr. Bernstein told her, you may just need to give your pancreas a little bit of rest. So your body was made for insulin, but a problem with that is some type 1 diabetics or type 2s that feel they need to take insulin, or your doctor says, yeah, you better be taking insulin as well as maybe a diabetic med, even though you are type 2, but you're a very poorly functioning type 2, your pancreas is barely putting out insulin, you need a little help. But sometimes people that take insulin assume, well, I'm good then. I can eat whatever I like. And if I eat too many carbs or too much ice cream, then I give myself more insulin. A worst thing you can do. If you have to take insulin, take insulin. But who says you have to eat ice cream? There is no law that says you have to eat ice cream or candy or pie or baked potatoes or rice. There's no law that says you have to eat those. So, the idea of eating a lot of carbs and taking a lot of insulin. Eat lots of carbs, take lots of insulin. Well, it's kind of like this. Imagine if a person has this obsession with hitting themselves on the head with a hammer, but it's giving them headaches. And so they throw their hammer away, but now they're missing all that hammer hitting. They just kind of enjoyed hitting themselves with a hammer. And they complain to a relative and says, well, I've got this solution for you. He goes out and buys you a brand new hammer, shiny, beautiful hammer. But along with the hammer, he says, this is your birthday present. It's your birthday. Here's your birthday present, a brand new shiny hammer. So whenever you feel the obsession, that terrible urge to hit yourself in the head, you can do it with a shiny new hammer. But, he says, to make your life a little bit better and easier, here's a big bottle of aspirin. So when you start to get a headache from all those hitting with the hammer, you pull out the aspirin bottle and take several aspirin, and that'll fix you. So from then on, your life is consisting of lots of hitting with the hammer and lots of aspirin. Well, that's dumb. You don't need aspirin if you stop hitting your head with the hammer. And you don't need so much insulin. I won't say you don't need any. That's between you and your doctor, but I'll say you won't need so much. If you stop eating that ice cream and pie and cake and baked potatoes and pasta and starchy foods of all kinds, rice, breakfast cereal, if you stop all that and start eating more meat and salads, low-carb veggies, you won't need so much insulin. Maybe you'll need some. Again, that's between you and your doctor, but you won't nearly need so much. You know, in the diabetic world and on YouTube, a lot of times we hear the idea a type 1's problem is they don't make enough insulin. And a type 2 diabetic's problem is they make too much insulin. Their body's overproducing. And often and usually that's the case. And that was certainly the case with me. My pancreas was dumping out way too much insulin. That was giving me my hypoglycemia because it would dump out far too much. At first it would go high and then it would go low. So we say, if you're type 2, your body's making too much insulin. There's no point in giving you more insulin. What you need to do is eat less carbs. Then you won't need more insulin. But there are type 2 diabetics whose pancreas has been so compromised and blown out by constantly stressing it with carbs and sugars, breakfast, lunch, dinner, snacks, late night snacks, carbs and sugars. And your pancreas is just blown out and you hardly make any insulin at all. You're not quite type 1, and the truth is, even if your pancreas quits working altogether, you're not technically type 1 because a type 1 has had an autoimmune disease, usually when they're young. But you've blown out your pancreas, and in practical terms, you're about like a type 1. You just don't produce insulin. So yeah, if that's your case, you need to take some insulin. And nothing wrong with it. It's not evil. Some people will say, well, my doctor said I should take insulin, and I revolted at the idea. I couldn't even stand the thought of sticking myself with a needle. Well, believe me, if my pancreas was blown out and I could barely produce insulin, I could easily stand that thought. I would do it in a heartbeat if that's what I needed. But it turns out I didn't need that. So the key is just don't overdo it. You weren't made to stuff yourself with carbs and sugars constantly. Now, I will say that my feeling is, and I hear this once in a while, it's not a majority thought that I hear. Most people don't say this, but some do. They'll say, Dennis, I've done low carb for a year. I don't eat hardly any carbs, maybe a salad or two or occasional low-carb veggies, but it's mostly meat and dairy products, low-carb foods. I've done it for a year, and I'm not much better than I was a year before. If that's the case, one thing to check out with your doctor is my pancreas making much insulin? My guess is in many of those cases, it's not. Your pancreas is just eking out a little bit of insulin to try to keep up, and it can't do it. And even though you're eating low carb, just even a low carb meal with maybe 15 grams of carbs at that breakfast, lunch, or dinner, just that few is too much for your poor pancreas that's just so deteriorated that it can't keep up. The good news is that can change, and pancreas can regain some of their function. No guarantee, won't always happen, but in many cases it can happen. So start by giving your pancreas a rest, and if it's absolutely necessary, if your doctor can assure you, yeah, your pancreas is barely putting out insulin, maybe it would be time to inject yourself with insulin, small amounts to cover small low-carb meals, and give your pancreas a rest until it can recover. Most Americans cannot even imagine the terrible poverty that pervades much of Africa. Many Africans eat meat 2 or 3 times per year, not because they're vegans, but because they cannot afford chicken, beef, or even fish. Many African children never receive a toy as a gift. Not for their birthday, not for Christmas, not ever. It's all parents can do to feed their families, and toys for children are considered a waste of money. Many African widows are forgotten, neglected, and live out their remaining years in terrible poverty, often in a constant state of near starvation. We cannot feed all of Africa by any means, but we can at least do something for some of them. We arranged a sumptuous early Christmas dinner this month in 2 communities, one in Nigeria and one in Kenya. And we made sure they had plenty of chicken, along with vegetables, ugali or fufu, and other delicious foods. But there was more than just a nice meal. We set up a special Christmas service for pastors and their wives and the local widows that would last throughout the afternoon. There was praise and worship. We had the building decorated with ribbons to give the event a special Christmas flavor. We had a local pastor preach a Christmas sermon, and then there was more praise and worship. And then we arranged a large-screen TV showing of a Birth of Jesus Bible study that Benedict and I did recently. We provided food for the local widows and toys and school supplies for the local orphans. Some of the widows were so moved by being remembered that they had tears in their eyes. For many of these orphans, receiving a toy was the first time in their entire lives that they had ever received a toy for Christmas. And everyone so appreciated the dinner. They just loved that chicken and the vegetables and the ugali or fufu. John the Baptist said this, "Let him who has 2 tunics share with him who has none." We Americans, well, we're the ones with the 2 tunics, or maybe 5 or 10 or 100. And it's only right that we should share with our struggling African brothers and sisters and make their lives a little bit easier and happier when we can. We do this because of the love of Jesus, and we do it in His name. Please pray about making a generous donation in support of these outreaches and the teaching of God's Word to the nations.
Merry Christmas!
Merry